is, or this afternoon, I should say, is historical fiction, and in particular, the process of fictionalizing history from a writer's point of view. Historical fiction is a very popular medium, and one which we're all extra conscious of at the moment, maybe because of the recent death of Hilary Mantel, who was one of its greatest practitioners. But as well as being popular, it's also complex and sometimes controversial. There are 3 or 4 main types of historical fiction, or different ways in which writers fictionalize history. The first is about a particular period, real people and real events, most famously as in Wolf Hall and the other books in that series by Mantel. Then more commonly maybe there is fiction set against a specific background and time, but about imaginary people and events. And you could think of A Tale of Two Cities maybe, and The Kite Runner quite differently. And thirdly, and intriguingly, there can be fiction involving 2 separate timelines, where a person today discovers someone in an earlier period, perhaps a relative or an ancestor, and whose life and times interests them, and they become involved with it. And their 2 parallel stories run together. And although I must confess I haven't read it, I think Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks is a very interesting example of that. And lastly, and a bit disreputably, there is historical fantasy or alternative history, where a writer thinks, what if things didn't happen like that? Maybe the war was won by a different country, or 2 people met who never did. And the best example I can think of is Robert Harris's Fatherland, which imagines that Germany won the Second World War and remained authoritarian and suppressed all knowledge of what had gone before, particularly the Holocaust. But then gradually information begins to seep out. It's a wonderful novel, I think. But whatever the type, I think the same issues and complexities are relevant to them all. And the main one, of course, is factual accuracy and inaccuracy, often found, the inclusion of wrong or incomplete or one-sided facts, where only one side of the story is given. Sometimes an author will distort facts for reasons that they sometimes call emotional truth, or sometimes it's just commercialism. And we're all hearing a lot about The Crown at the moment, aren't we? And sometimes a writer can introduce an imaginary character to tell the story of a real one, because perhaps the real story doesn't have any particular narrative line. And I think Pat Barker did some of that, didn't she, when she introduces a doctor to the regeneration stories and tells the story, which otherwise don't have a particular storyline in them. So, and the other issue, I think, is not offending people who may be still alive or ancestors. And apart from The Crown, which we're all heartily sick of, there's a novel called The Glass Room, which was written about Czechoslovakia 100 years ago, about a real house built by a real family to celebrate the emergence of Czechoslovakia as a free country. And the glass room symbolized freedom and democracy and openness. But certain relatives of the original characters apparently complained about how they were being portrayed. So you might have to, even that was 100 years ago, so you never know. You're going to have to be careful, aren't you? Some would say, especially writers, what does it matter? What matters is the writer's imagination and their skill. and I'm sure Rebecca has a view about that. And Rebecca's going to tell us about how she negotiates these complexities in her own work. Rebecca's a very successful award-winning writer who's written several works of historical fiction. And last year she spoke to us about her short story collection, Artefacts, many of which were set in around the First World War. But she's written other novels as well about other times. So she's very well placed to talk about how fiction and history work together, how the writer fictionalizes history, and as she says, how the writer sets the facts alight. So welcome, Rebecca. And again, if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat box and hopefully we'll be able to deal with them later. Thank you very much. And now all yours, Rebecca. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Frances, for that introduction. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm very pleased to be here again this year. Really enjoyed my time at the festival last year, so I was really chuffed to be asked. So I'm going to talk to you about historical fiction, and I'm going to share my screen, and this is where we see if the technology will work. That's not the right screen.
That's right. It's okay.
Oh dear. Not sure how to stop sharing. Stop sharing. Oh, stop sharing. Let me try and find. Sorry, apologies for this. I'm trying to find my way around Zoom, but as soon as I crack it, we'll be all good.
Good luck. It's the first problem we've had this afternoon.
Here we go. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Now I'm just going to try and make it bigger. There we are. Can you all see that all right?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So Frances kindly mentioned that I'm a writer of historical fiction. I am, and I've just flashed up some images here of the historical fiction that I've written. And they're all available for you to go away and read later. I can share the links. The first and the third are set in colonial New Zealand, which is a very important time to me personally, and you'll hear why. And as we go through, I'll explain how I've approached writing historical fiction. But I think it would be a good start if I start my talk with a quote from Hilary Mantel, who's the loss of Mantel is incredible to literature and historical fiction. Devastating to hear the news. But she once commented, "My first book was a historical novel. I started writing in 1974. In those days, historical novels meant ladies with swelling bosoms on the cover. Basically, it meant historical romance. It was not respectable as a genre." So I think this quote is one that has got numerous doors that we can prise open, much like the art of writing historical fiction itself. I think we can all imagine the covers that Mantel refers to. Even if we've never read a Georgette Heyer, we can imagine covers with a pink background, Georgian ladies swooning on a chaise lounge, cripplingly handsome man hovering in the background waiting to pounce on her. What does she mean by respectable? I think she means at that time historical fiction wasn't taken seriously by reviewers and journalists, those self-appointed bastions of culture. I don't think it's a fair way to treat literary genres. I think there's value in all kinds of writing, even if it's not our own cup of tea. There will always be writers and there will always be readers. But the broadsheet scrutinizing gaze on historical fiction has changed, if it was ever as Mantel describes in the first place. And Mantel has been an integral part of bringing historical fiction back into the respectable circle. But I would say she's an army of many. Another quote that I think is really interesting when we think about historical fiction is this one from Geraldine Brooks. She's an Australian journalist and also a writer of historical fiction. And one of her books won the Pulitzer Prize about 10 years ago. And she said, the thing that most attracts me to historical fiction is taking the factual record as far as it is known, using that as scaffolding, and then letting imagination build the structure that fills in those things that we can never find out for sure. And I think her reference to facts as being the base for historical fiction, that scaffolding, that then has imaginative layering above that, I think that gets to the heart of the issue that writers of historical fiction are faced with. How far does fact go? And when does fantasy insert itself? If we imagine a house with Brooks's facts as being the steel core, how do we elaborate as writers? What decor do we bring to the house? How do we shape the rooms? What colour do we paint the walls of our fiction with imagined life? And before answering this and drawing on my own writing experience to give some kind of answers, I want to mention writers who have constructed their own magnificent houses of historical fiction. Writers that I think are fantastic at this. This list, of course, is by no means exhaustive, and I will say writers that you may not have read or won't include writers that you think should be on there. But these are writers that I return to, and I'll say why. This one is Pat Barker, and Frances mentioned Pat Barker earlier. Her Regeneration trilogy is one of the best sets of books about the First World War that I've ever read. But I particularly like the books that she writes about ancient Greece and Troy, The Silence of the Girls and the Women of Troy. And what she does that I love in these books is she takes the voices of the silence and puts them at the forefront of their writing. So she writes about the women's experience, slave women, concubines, the wives who were captured and then enslaved. And for me, this is historical fiction's great appeal. It's an opportunity to flip the canonical representation of the past on its head and bring forth the sounds of the unknown or the unheard. So the inner life of Briseis, that's how you say it, who was the forced lover of Achilles, that we read about in The Silence of the Girls, for example, her voice is prefaced. And then that allows Barker to open up a window into a past that's perhaps not widely known or understood. And I think that's a really appealing way to use fiction. Another writer who I love is Sarah Waters. And in some ways, she was my gateway historical fiction writer. She was one of the first historical fiction writers that I read. She does something that I think is the hardest thing to do, but also one of the most vital. So her novels generally are set in the Victorian era, but she also writes in the 1940s or 1920s. And what she does that's so incredible is she spins words where the scaffolding that Brooks mentions is integral to the story, but it's somehow invisible. What I mean is Waters has historical settings that move through her characters. Her characters will live in a setting. They'll clean, they'll make tea, they'll have a reality of a life that Waters refers to, but she does it without any fuss or emphasis. There's no drawing attention to it in the narrative. There's no information dump in Waters' books. That's a phrase I'm sure you will recognise. There's no halting exposition. The writer, and because of that, the writer, much like the scaffolding, is invisible because she doesn't explain the setting. It's there. And the characters and then the reader live in it. And for me, that makes it really convincing, great historical writing. So what I want to talk to you about is some of my books. So I write novels and short stories, the majority of which are historical fiction. When I started writing seriously about 15 years ago, I didn't consider myself to be an historical novelist. In fact, I didn't think about the genre at all, and I just wrote the stories I wanted to write. But it just so happened that the stories from the past are the ones that appeal to me. I like to tease out the patterns of modern life, meaning I like to see how the past is replicated in the present, and what's happening now may well have happened before. But I had one added motivation personally for writing historical fiction, and that's because I had an abundance of research already undertaken, research that was at my fingertips and research that I knew very well. And that's because I did a PhD in English literature 15 years ago. And I was able to draw on the research I conducted for that PhD to form the basis, the scaffolding for my fiction. And the reason New Zealand is up here is because my PhD was on the writing and the literary responses of settler women, British settler women, to life in colonial New Zealand. Why New Zealand? Well, I stumbled into loving New Zealand literature when I was an undergrad at university after reading The Bone People by Kerry Hume, who died just last year. She won the Booker Prize in the mid-80s, and I read it, and it blew me away. It turned me onto a kind of literature, a kind of writing that I'd not experienced before. And I spent a summer ransacking the small New Zealand section of the University of Dundee Library. The lives of British women who emigrated to New Zealand in the 19th century absolutely fascinated me. I thought they were so brave, so took such a leap of faith when they emigrated. They said goodbye at that time to family and friends, possibly forever, because the journey out to New Zealand was about 3 months and cost a lot of money. And they travelled to the bottom of the world. And in those first years of emigration, they actually built their own homes. So they created their own houses physically. And all the time they wrote about this. So they would write letters back home that would be sent with ships returning to the UK. They wrote diaries that they would send home at the end of the year. And then ultimately, they would start writing fiction. And when I was researching for my PhD, I spent several months in New Zealand with the University of Auckland, travelling the country, accessing archives and reading this material. And I was fortunate enough as well to meet the descendants of some writers, so great-grandchildren who had kept archives from their writers' ancestors and not sent them to a public archive and not shared them, but I was privileged that they shared them with me. Now, all of this made for brilliant academic material for a PhD. But the experiences that I read about in New Zealand, these women's experiences, was more than a PhD to me. It started to form a kind of sediment, as I would describe it that way, that then underpinned my own fictional writing. I couldn't get the words of these women out of my head. And what's on the screen is an old map of New Zealand, and then a poster from the New Zealand Company, which was founded in the 1840s to try and encourage settlers from Britain over to New Zealand. Not always honest in how they represented New Zealand to try and attract emigrants, but this was the kind of poster that was out and about that encouraged people to emigrate. And they emigrated on these kind of sailing ships originally. And it's not very clear, these photos, but the sailing ships were difficult. It was difficult experience for these women. It was cramped. It's ever-present issue of seasickness. Disease could be rife. It was a very brave thing for these women to do. Not all of them had the choice. They had to accompany menfolk, fathers, husbands who made those decisions. But the courage that they displayed on their travels and then when they settled was very inspirational. The last 40 years or so has seen an uncovering and rediscovery of lives of women like these settler women in New Zealand. And in academic terms, there's a wealth of important work about social and post-colonial experiences and the impact of the politics of empire on the Indigenous community, which could be devastating. This isn't the remit of this talk. It did form part of what I did in my PhD, but I need to mention it because it was, it's problematic, and it's also something that's, I think, being recovered again these days. If you look at the National Trust initiative, the work they're doing to peel back how these country houses were funded and the money that these wealthy landed families had, where that came from. I think this is all very relevant and important. But what I want to show you today is how I preface the settler female voice in my fiction, how I looked at the lives of those living on the margins. And I'm going to turn to one example. This is an image of what settler life was like in New Zealand. So it's very basic. You can see there was some houses that were thrown together when immigrants arrived. This is a painting that was made at the time of Wellington in about the 1850s. So, you were quite exposed. It was a very brave step to take. And one of the people who took that was a lady called Mary Taylor. She was a close friend of Charlotte Bronte. And Taylor's family suffered a reduction in financial circumstances in the 1840s. And like many middle-class women at that time, she had very limited opportunities for employment and independence. So she made a monumental decision. And as Charlotte Bronte wrote in a letter to another friend, Ellen Nussey, Mary decided, Mary's made up her mind she cannot and will not be a governess, a teacher, a milliner, a bonnet maker, nor a housemaid. She sees no means of obtaining employment she would like in England, so she's leaving it. And that's a photo of Mary Taylor later in life. So I think you can agree it was quite a brave thing to do. And I think we need to appreciate the courage this decision took. Taylor emigrated to Wellington at a time when the city was barely established, and she went into business for herself. She opened a shop, and I visited the location in Wellington where it stood. And Taylor threw herself into colonial life. She built friendships, built a community around herself, and later a cousin of hers moved out to be with her. But it would have been as alien to many back home in the UK as it would have been moving to the moon. I explore the sense of taking a leap into the unknown in my novel, Beyond the Bay. This is set in Auckland in 1893. New Zealand had been colonised by the British since the 1840s, but Auckland was still a young city. It was still finding its place. There are two characters in Beyond the Bay, two central characters, Isabel and Esther. They are sisters, and they both experienced the same dislocation that countless settler women did who emigrated to New Zealand and who wrote about it. So what I mean by that is the psychological burden caused by the separation from loved ones back in Britain and the internal confusion about where home was. This sense of dislocation that I portray in my novel is something that I experienced, that I encountered, I should say, again and again when I was doing my PhD in the archival writing by New Zealand women. And again, Taylor summed this up perfectly. She described the dichotomy of her life in Wellington in a letter to Charlotte Bronte of 1851. And in it, she said, "I can hardly explain to you the queer feeling of living as I do in two places at once. One world containing books, England, and all the people with whom I can exchange an idea. The other, all that I can actually see and hear and speak to. The separation is as complete as between the things in a picture and the things in the room. The puzzle is that both move and act, and I must say my say as one of each. The result is that one world must at least think me crazy. I am just now in a sad mess." So, I mean, I think she's been a bit rude about there are people back in England that she can exchange an idea, and she can't do that with people in New Zealand. It's not quite the case. She had a very rich cultural life, but what she is showing is that disconnect between maybe where her heart, where her soul is back in the UK, but where she lives in reality in New Zealand. And of all my doctoral research, it's this sense of an inner splintering that I couldn't shake off when I came to write my novel Beyond the Bay. So what I show in Beyond the Bay, this internal wrangling that Esther and Isabel go through, that's rooted in real fact. I read countless letters and diaries by settler women where they described feelings of intense loneliness and discord. Another example can be found in the writing of a woman called Agnes Jameson, who lived in New Zealand at the end of the 19th century. And she described what her mother's experience had been. Her mother had emigrated 30 years before. And this is one of those examples of, I was able to read this private diary that wasn't in the archive, which really captured that internal splintering. And Jameson wrote, "My mother told me that the loneliness of her life at Lowbourne was at times almost greater than she could bear. Father was away on the run, that would be a sheep run, a great deal of his time. My mother said that the wind came sighing and soughing through the long tussocks on the riverbed flats with such a lonely sound. It was a wind that seemed to come from nowhere and was going nowhere, and it met no one on the way." That must have been such a lonely life, with yourself and children, and that's it, nobody else around you. And that unfortunately was the reality of many women who emigrated to New Zealand in the mid 19th century. And I couldn't stop thinking about the courage of women like Agnes Jameson's mother when I came to write my fiction. Also, as I mentioned earlier, women in New Zealand were required, certainly in the first years of settlement, to physically build their own homes. So another letter that I read was from a lady called Sarah Higgins, who emigrated to New Zealand in 1842. And she wrote about building her own house. And she said, "Now, I wanted a good kitchen, but my husband couldn't leave his work to make it. He helped me mix the clay before he went to work. Then I got a little maid to mind the children while I put up a mud kitchen, 20 feet long and 12 feet wide. We now had a comfortable house of 6 rooms." This isn't something she'd done before, but it was done out of necessity. And that courage, that just getting on with it, rolling up your sleeves, is something that I found so inspiring, and I wanted to write about it. Another woman, James Bannerman, who lived in New Zealand around the same time, described the overlapping of domestic space because it was difficult to separate rooms when you were building it yourself. So if you listen to her words, just imagine the lack of privacy they would have had. So I'm sorry, I haven't got the slide for that, but I'll read it out. She said, "The kitchen of my Otago home was drawing room, dining room, and kitchen all in one." And I wanted to capture the pressures of life like that, where everything was so contained and you had no separation of space. I wanted to capture that in my novel. So I had Isabel and Esther in Beyond the Bay living in a one-room shack with Isabel's husband and all the social awkwardness that entailed. Yet, New Zealand was a place where the rules of social etiquette could be challenged. You were moving 11,000 miles away from home, so there was a natural loosening of those societal expectations. And women in New Zealand were, because they had to roll up their sleeves and make their own homes, they challenged the status quo. And in actual fact, New Zealand was the first country, not the first state, because there's some states in America that did this, but the first country in the world to give women the vote in 1893. And I do think a big part of that was the fearlessness of settler women who had such a difficult experience in the early years of settlement, who desired a voice in society. So New Zealand could be a place where things could change and things could be done differently. And I've shown that, I tried to show that in my novel, In Beyond the Bay. I had a character called Rachel, and she's described as a pioneer because she came out 20 years before Isabel and Esther. And she encourages the women around her to see New Zealand as a land of opportunity. And one of the comments she makes is, well, this is the place for straightening things out. It doesn't have to matter what baggage you come out with, not if you want to start again. And later she said, New Zealand is the land where women can define themselves, if only they had the courage. And I think certainly there were many women whose stories I read, whose letters home that I read, who definitely had the courage. So what I wanted to do was to bring this kind of reality to the forefront in my fiction, and honour these women in a way, their bravery, making their new homes. So when I came to write Beyond the Bay, I rooted my story in fact and years of research, and also my other collection, my short story collection, The Settling Earth, which was on the first slide, that also draws on research about New Zealand in the colonial period. But then the question historical fiction writers have to ask themselves is, at what point do you leave the facts, that scaffolding, and when do you allow your imagination to flow? And for me, the make-believe comes with characterization and plot. A character might live through a real-life event, so emigrating, for example. But the beauty of fiction, and really what makes fiction different to history, is the exploration and representation of the character's inner life. What does that woman feel when she steps onto an emigrant ship for the first time? What motivated her to emigrate? Did she have a choice? How does she cope with the crampedness of the ship's cabins and the poor quality of food? How does she manage the grief of leaving family behind? Does she feel sorrow at the parting? And if not, why not? So these are the areas where we as writers can allow words to sing. We can take the scaffolding of facts and then construct a beautiful palace on top of them. So, as I mentioned, Beyond the Bay is set in 1893, in the year that New Zealand women were granted the right to vote. And this momentous event is used as background context. Isabel is active in gathering the petition that helped persuade the New Zealand government to allow this. And I describe Isabel's motivation and how ultimately living in New Zealand did give her that sense of freedom, where she could, if she was brave enough, and she was brave enough, to determine the path her life took. I also moved real characters around in the background. They weren't active participants, but they were relevant off stage. Kate Shepherd, for example, she was a real life character who is an instrumental figure in New Zealand's women push for the vote. And I had Isabel refer to her several times in Beyond the Bay. So this leads on to the question of how to write historical fiction about real characters. It's not something I've done yet where I've focused exclusively on a real character, but I have used, I'll just stop sharing this so I can actually, I have used real characters as the basis for one of my books, and that is a book called Keziah and Rosie. That book is about the summer two young girls spend with their grandparents, and it's set in 1986 and in a Midlands town, and it's very much a work of fiction. It's historical fiction because sadly, yes, the 1980s would be classed as historical fiction now. This makes me feel hideously old. And to a certain extent, the characters in that book are based on my sister and me, and our grandma and granddad. Because of that, it's a book where I've had to tread carefully. I have a complicated family, but Grandma and Grandad were very important to my sister and I. I started writing Keziah and Rosie during the first lockdown. The book grew from a sense of living in a cocoon at that time, like we all were, no social contact, everybody staying at home. And I felt compelled to write about a time when I had a similar experience. For my sister and I, that cocoon, that safety, that safe space with our grandparents. So some of the daft things that Grandad does in Keziah and Rosie, and the loving embrace of both grandparents, that's real. For example, there's a chapter in the book where Grandad makes up a bread poultice for Rosie when her arm hurts. My Grandad used to do things like that. A bread poultice would save everything, in his opinion. He had an allotment and he used to swing my sister and I on the gate, and that is replicated in Keziah and Rosie. Also, Grandma, in both the book and real life, would knit and buy cherry pop for the girls on a Saturday night. Those things are real, those facts are real, but plot is totally imagined and made up. Certain people might recognise my grandparents because of the description of their kitchen and some of the daft things that Grandad did, but they won't recognise the narrative drive. That's made up. Having said that, I did think sometime about whether I should publish Keziah and Rosie, because I was writing about two people who were very dear to me. And I wondered if family members, and again, relationships are complicated, I wonder if family members would feel aggrieved at Edith and Bernard in the book, their grandma and granddad. Again, names are changed. But I decided I had as much right to write about them as anybody else. And also maybe a bit of a cop-out, maybe everything I wrote in Keziah and Rosie showed those characters positively. That's because for me, my grandma and granddad were perfect. If our relationship had been difficult, I maybe would have written a different book, or maybe would have avoided it. So I'm going to just say a few words finally about another aspect of historical writing. Frances mentioned this at the start, and it's a kind of fictional writing, historical writing, that many of us are familiar with as readers. And it's the merging of a contemporary narrative arc with a narrative arc set in the past. It's where a book follows a dual timeline, sometimes a triple timeline. When I read novels structured in this way, I'm reminded of the point that I made earlier, that what's happening now has happened before, and there are parallels between the historical timeline and the contemporary one. That's the structure I used in my historical novel, The Bishop's Girl. That novel was set in modern times, France in the First World War, and Greece at the turn of the century. It draws on real events, such as the Great War, and some aspects of life in Greece at the turn of the 19th century. But the scaffolding of the book is more loose. So there's not as much small detail to it. But instead, what drives the book is the theme of uncovering a hidden identity. The book is about an archivist who spent several years trying to identify the body of a young woman who was found buried with a prominent bishop. Jess, the archivist, has had this research focus forced upon her by her male boss, and the theme of women's voices being marginalised recurs throughout the book. Jess discovers the woman's identity early on, so it's not, The Bishop's Girl isn't a historical mystery as such, but instead it's a journey where an unnamed woman is given a life. So her life and her story is uncovered rather than just a name. And similarly, Jess goes on a personal journey where she reassesses her own life. So there are parallels between these kinds of discovery. So I'm looking at the time, and I'm going to end here, hopefully for some questions and a bit of a chat. And thank you very much for listening. It was a bit of a gallop through my historical fiction, but I hope you found it interesting.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was fascinating, and I'm sure none of us knew anything at all about the pictures you've painted at New Zealand. I've started your book, and one thing I remember is you describing them papering the walls, the women papering the walls of their houses with newspaper to keep out the, just with paste, to keep out the drafts and the cold. It's a complete revelation. Was New Zealand different, would you say, to Australia, or was it just New Zealand where these women went out and had this terrible life? Would you know?
So maybe a terrible life is maybe a heavy word. Difficult, challenging. Yes, absolutely. No, I mean, they went out to Canada. There were settler communities out in Canada, settler communities in Australia. There's a strong genre of Australian fiction of women living in the bush, being isolated in the bush. Yeah, so it's not unique to New Zealand, but I think what is unique to New Zealand, the strength of it, is this cleaving to home, to the UK as home. I think that's a stronger sense that you get in New Zealand communities, in settler communities in New Zealand, than perhaps so in Australia, because it was colonised under a different approach in Australia. And it led to a real uncertainty in some of these women. There were rules of social etiquette that many clung on to, leaving calling cards, for example, when he would visit a neighbour. But that visit would be on horseback, riding on horseback for half a day, and then leaving a calling card. And it became evident that people thought that this stuff was a waste of time. You know, we can do this differently, and we can control things differently for ourselves. And I think that came out very strongly in the letters by New Zealand women. They really did question things quite early on.
Right. Is there any other field of historical fiction that you would like to broach? Obviously, the New Zealand was something you had the chance for with the PhD. Is there any other area of fiction you'd like to, historical fiction that you'd like to tackle?
Yeah, so I am halfway through writing a new novel, historical fiction, which is based in the mid-80s in East Berlin. So before the wall came down. And it follows a group of characters living in Berlin, Germans living in Berlin, and what that kind of repressed life was like, that paranoid life, which I find quite fascinating, how that, whether you were being watched or not, you still shaped your behaviour, the thought of somebody keeping an eye on you and the danger that brought. So it's an area that I found, it's in a way it's quite in vogue as well. There's been a resurgence of interest in Berlin in the 1980s. I think it goes in fashion, the fashionable stages of.
There's been a radio series about it, actually. I was thinking that Fatherland might, in some way, it describes. Well, I don't think it was this, East and West, but the sort of repressive regime that might be somewhat similar to the East Berlin that actually happened. I suppose slavery in England would be an interesting topic to, how it worked with the people who ran it and any slaves that were got over here. There's huge areas. There's so much historical fiction written about certain areas, isn't there?
Yes.
But so many areas which are not covered at all.
Very much so.
If people aren't fortunate enough to have PhDs and grants, how can people best do research these days? Of course, there's a lot more online, but any tips for people doing research these days?
We are very lucky in having so much online. Many archival collections now are digitized. There's been a change in academic view of that. So there's a push for a lot to be made open access. It's not a quick process. There's lots of stuff that's not available online, but certainly I started my PhD 20 years ago, and there was nothing. The internet was in its infancy. There was very little online. So we are looking that there's so much that we can access.
Those letters from the New Zealand ladies and so on, are they online now?
No. So there'll be small snippets online. New Zealand, the archive has a plethora of stuff that you can read. There is a wonderful book that was published, I think 2001, as I was coming to the end of my PhD, that has excerpts from dozens and dozens of New Zealand women who were writing letters and diaries home, which was perfect, but it wasn't everything. It was a taste. So yeah, I was very fortunate. I mean, I didn't get a grant when I was doing my PhD. I did it part-time, so it was a labour of love for a long time. But yeah, I mean, I had it there at my fingertips, and I know that it did help, because I could go off on these fictional, imaginative sprees, having the scaffolding to base it on. But to research about Berlin in the 1980s, for example, stuff online, books at the library, listening to the radio, listening to the stuff that you were talking about, the radio BBC iPlayer's got a lot of
series about people
on
escape to the West, just leaping to Keziah and Rosie, did anybody in your family object? Of course, your grandparents would have been dead by then, so nobody objected to anything.
No, nobody objected. I mean, I think it's just there was no reason for anyone to object, because it was. I think the two of them are beautifully portrayed. They're portrayed with a lot of love. But it's putting memories out into the public, which are not just my memories. And I wondered if there might be, not quite a taken offence, but didn't know that was for public consumption. That kind of approach to it. But, I'm a writer. It's what I wanted to do, and essentially the book, I think I've described this to you before, Frances. The book is a love story to my grandparents, and I think it's a way of honouring them.
Did they die before you wrote? So you never got to receive this love story?
Yeah, my granddad died in 1995, and my grandma in 2002. So before I'd finished my PhD, before my granddad died when I was 18. But it was that strength of love that they gave my sister and I that just carried into my writing.
Well, it's there in the book. There's no definition of what's history. I mean, I was a bit appalled by thinking that 1980s is history. But there isn't any. I've asked one or two people and they say different things. So. I know Rebecca's books are in Waterstones for anybody who wanted to obtain them. There were a couple of questions on chat. Anne said that she loved the Bone People. And I think Marilyn asked if you prefer to write short stories or novels.
Oh, is that picking a favourite child? No, I can't say either way. I like the snappiness of a short story. So having an idea and diving in and completing something, producing this gem or not a gem, that I can go to a publisher or a journal. There you go, it's done. I'm feeling that immediate sense of achievement, whether it's published or not, but that sense of having completed something. But then again, the writing a novel, it's a much longer labour, but it is extremely satisfying when it's, and the big chunkiness of a novel when it's done there's nothing quite like it. I couldn't say either way. I just know that I have to be writing. And when I'm writing a novel, that's humming away in the background, but I still write short stories. So the short stories are like the wheels keeping the whole engine going.
Well, it's a good way of putting it. Anne Goodwin has asked, what is the title of it's Beyond the Bay, isn't it, the novel about?
Yes, the novel is Beyond the Bay. Yeah,
and
that's
I've got that, Anne. I can lend that to you. She's a colleague of mine. I don't know if anybody else has any questions. I think we're running out of time now. Don't think there's anything I wanted to ask. General trends in historical fiction are going to be to do with minority ethnic groups, aren't they, on the whole? And women, as you know, marginalized women, and maybe these odd periods of history that I was thinking about the Middle Ages in England. And a lot of women actually had quite a lot of power then, didn't they? Because their husbands were all off on the Crusades or whatever. And I read that quite a lot of women had their amount of power then. They ran their farms and their homesteads. But how on earth you find out about that?
Yes, not a lot of archival material. There'll be lots of learned people who research that area, I'm sure. So if that's an area that interests you, I think fundamentally I'd say read as much as you can.
Yeah.
Anything around the area that you're interested in. Yeah. Read everything.
Sarah Waters said, because I loved Fingersmith as well. And she said she just read as much as she could to get that real Victorian feel, which is wonderful. Well, I don't think there are any more questions. It's been a wonderful talk, really, really interesting. And I'm sure it's opened up a lot of new horizons. So thank you very much. And good luck with your next East German book.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, Frances, for being a wonderful host, and all your questions. It's really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Take